Hello everybody, and today we're going to begin our lesson on the second group of vertebrates that we began our conversation on, amphibians. So before we start the note on amphibians, I want you to just take a minute to think about, well, what is your current understanding of amphibians? What are some examples of some amphibians? How do you think that amphibians came to be? What is the evolutionary pathway? Okay, well, now that hopefully you've taken some time to think about that, let's take a look. So, amphibians, which have class Amphibia, that's the name of their class distinction in terms of taxonomy. They include frogs, toads, and salamanders. Now, I'm guessing that you probably came up with frogs, but maybe that salamander may have been a stretch for you. But there you have it. So how did they evolve? Well, they evolved from fish, as you might expect. Why might we expect that? Well, because fish are solely aquatic, for the most part, and amphibians, I believe amphi means dual. So, amphibians will live on land and in water, at least a certain part of their life they will exist in water, and a certain part of their life primarily in land. So they were the first vertebrates to make the transition from water to land. So we would say that they are the first tetrapods. So tetra meaning four and pod meaning feet, right? So, think about their four appendages. Let's look at this phylogenetic tree here, okay? This is just an evolutionary tree, and we can examine sort of the family tree of all of the vertebrates minus the fish. We're not putting the fish in here. So if we look at that, we see the tetrapod body. Fish evolved into organisms with a tetrapod body. But then there's a schism. There's a divide there because amphibians have aquatic larvae. Well, what does that mean? That means that they lay eggs in the water, whereas all of these other groups of vertebrates, reptiles, birds, and mammals, have all evolved to have what we call the amniotic egg, and we're going to learn more about that in a little while. Okay, so one major distinction between amphibians, and fish for that matter, and these other classes of vertebrates is that amphibians have aquatic larvae, even though they do live on land and have a tetrapod body. So in terms of reproduction, amphibians will lay their eggs in water. And I want to see if I can pull up a browser picture of frog eggs. You may have seen them if you were like me and went on adventures in your youth and stumbled upon ponds, tried to catch frogs, and maybe saw some frog eggs. They're usually this big mass. Yeah, there we go. So here are a few pictures of frog eggs, and maybe we can see some where they're developing into the tadpole. So frog eggs, let me see if I can add to this. Nope, frog eggs. And then tadpole. Let's try that again. Okay, so sometimes if you peer in, here are a few here. You can see that black sort of nucleus looking like dot that we saw in the last list of a bit of frog eggs. We can see that in this case they're evolving into the tadpole stage. And I think most of you are aware, if we look at the frog life cycle, that frogs begin as eggs, and we see the little tadpoles that are growing in the egg sacs. Eventually they burst out of the egg sac as tadpoles, as entirely aquatic organisms. Then they begin to have these little limb buds that eventually grow into their their front and their hind legs, and then eventually that tail we see disappear. All right, so now let's see what else we can find. In our images. Ooh, there's a giant tadpole. Take a look at that. That is incredible. Sometimes if you, I'm just peering through, this is very interesting. Sometimes if you even look at, if you're looking for, there looks like some eggs are coming out. Even if you, I'm going to get rid of this, are looking for frogs or were hunting frogs in your youth, you may have come across them and some of the frogs still had tails, right? That might have been the case. So reproduction, their eggs are laid in water, but that leaves them super vulnerable. So the frog's reproductive strategy is to lay a whole load of eggs, and then in the hopes that predators will not eat all of them, and maybe a few will survive long enough to reproduce and or to grow and reproduce their own eggs. Okay, so nutrition. So interestingly enough, the tadpole stage is aquatic, as we talked about, but also they're herbivorous. They are only eating plant material at that stage. Eventually they grow up into their adult stage where they are primarily terrestrial, depending, of course, on the amphibian to different degrees, but they're also carnivorous. You may remember in grade 10 when we dissected our frogs, some of you were able to pull out that tongue. Remember, the tongue was attached at the front of the frog's mouth, and the tongue would flip out, and some of you even saw flies underneath that, and other insects underneath that tongue, so that was kind of cool. Okay, respiration, so gas exchange. Let's see, I'm curious to know what you remember, if you remember about what we talked about with frogs. So frogs and other amphibians will have underdeveloped, not very complex lungs. So that means in order for them to get an adequate amount of oxygen, they need to also be able to absorb oxygen through their skin. So as tadpoles, of course, though, they're entirely aquatic, and so they are going to be able to respire through their gills, but the adults are going to be using those underdeveloped or primitive lungs and their moist skin as well. Now let's talk about circulation, specifically their circulatory system. If you're talking about a fish, do you remember how many chambers there were in the bony fish heart? The bony fish has a 2-chambered heart, which makes it pretty unsophisticated. So we know that frogs are more evolved relative to fish. And so what does their heart look like? They have a 3-chambered heart. So they have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. We're going to learn a little bit later on in this course about the difference between atria and ventricles. So, but they do have 1 more heart chamber in comparison to the fish, but 1 fewer heart chamber compared to mammals, to humans. The ventricle is going to receive oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So that's a problem. It's not really ideal because what you would have there is you would have the ventricle is going to be responsible for pumping oxygenated, reoxygenated blood back to the body. But if you have, let me draw a little quick picture. But if you have a 3-chambered heart, and the chamber, let's just divide this into 3 equally. It's not really like this, but that's okay. If you have the chamber that is responsible for pumping the blood back out into the body, and that blood is only partially oxygenated, that's not the most efficient situation, right? Ideally, the blood should be completely reoxygenated before entering the bloodstream again. However, frogs are not that evolved and their oxygen needs are lower. And so they're going to be able to get that blood pumped around sufficiently despite the fact that their heart's not as sophisticated. However, having said that, this is not the most efficient model. Okay, so that's the problem, right? The ventricle is going to be pumping blood to the lungs and the body at the same time, and that's not super amazing. All right, so that is it for amphibians. Of course, there's so much more to know about amphibians, but not within the scope of this course. What I'm going to have you do is I want you to, on Google Classroom, you'll see me post a worksheet that will ask you to do a little bit of reading on reptiles and birds. So you're going to find out a little bit about how reptiles and birds are similar and also how they are different, and also how they are similar and different to the other vertebrate groups. So enjoy, and please reach out if you have any questions for me.